Most mornings begin the same way. The air is still. The grass carries a thin layer of dew that catches the first light like scattered glass. Somewhere beyond the yard, a distant car passes, then fades. And for a moment, everything feels exactly as it did yesterday. You step outside with your coffee. The fence line stands where it always has. The old wooden post near the corner of the yard leans slightly now, weathered by years of rain, wind, and long-forgotten seasons. Nothing about it seems important. Most people would never look at it twice. But this morning, just as the sunlight begins to reach the top of the trees, something small drops out of the sky. A robin. It lands softly on that exact post. Not the branch above it. Not the patch of grass below. The post itself. It stays there for a few seconds, quiet and motionless, as if checking something only it can see. Then it flies away. The moment is so ordinary you could miss it entirely. And yet something about it lingers. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may change the way you look at every bird that visits your yard. The truth begins with moments exactly like this. Small moments. Easy to overlook. The kind that seem meaningless until they happen again, and then again. Because what makes this robin remarkable is not that it landed there once. It's that next spring, when the snow is gone and the trees begin to wake, it will return to that same post. And what happens after that is where the story becomes difficult to ignore. You have probably experienced something like this before, even if you never stop to think about it. A place that keeps pulling you back. Not because you have to go there. Not because there is anything remarkable about it. But because something about it feels familiar in a way that is difficult to explain. Maybe it is an old front porch where summer evenings seem to last forever. Maybe it is a stretch of road you have not driven in years, yet somehow still remember every curve. Or maybe it is simply a tree at the edge of a neighborhood where you once paused without realizing that the moment would stay with you. Most of us carry places like that. Quiet locations scattered throughout our lives that seem to hold more than wood, stone, grass, or soil. Places that remain with us long after we leave them behind. Standing in the yard, watching that weathered fence post catch the morning light, it is hard not to wonder if something similar exists in the lives of wild birds. Because the strange part is not that the robin appeared. Robins are everywhere in spring. The strange part is how ordinary the post seems. It is not the tallest point in the yard. It offers no obvious advantage. It does not stand out in any meaningful way. Yet year after year, when the cold finally loosens its grip and the first signs of spring begin to appear, the robin arrives and chooses that same spot. And after a while, you begin paying attention. You find yourself glancing toward the post before looking anywhere else. Not because you expect to see something extraordinary, but because something about the pattern feels important. And that feeling, quiet as it is, may be the beginning of a much larger story. At first, it seems like nothing more than a habit. A bird arrives, it leaves, the seasons change. Life moves on. But the longer you watch, the more difficult that explanation becomes. Because what appears random from a distance often looks very different when viewed up close. Researchers who spend years observing migratory birds have noticed something most people never see. The landscape around us is not experienced the same way by a robin. What looks like an ordinary backyard to you may exist inside a much larger and far more detailed map. A map built from morning light, tree lines, familiar sounds, and landmarks remembered across time. The old fence post stands quietly through summer storms and winter snow. Grass grows around it. Leaves gather at its base and disappear again. Yet somehow, when spring returns, the robin seems to recognize it immediately. Not after days of searching. Not after wandering through the yard. Almost as if it already knew exactly where it was going. And this is where the hidden layer begins to reveal itself. Because many of the birds we see every day are navigating lives far more complex than we imagine. They remember feeding grounds, nesting areas, safe routes through changing landscapes. Some return to places they have not seen in months, finding them with astonishing accuracy despite traveling hundreds or even thousands of miles. Most people never notice this because the arrivals happen quietly. There is no announcement, no dramatic moment, just a small shape appearing in the morning light exactly where it appeared before. And after enough years, the question slowly changes. It is no longer whether the robin remembers the place. The question becomes how much of its world exists in memory long before it ever arrives. There is a reason this story begins to feel less like coincidence the longer you sit with it. Not because the mystery disappears, but because the reality behind it is already remarkable enough. Scientists have discovered that migratory birds carry an extraordinary set of navigational abilities inside bodies that weigh only a few ounces. Long before the robin appears above the yard, it is already moving through a world filled with invisible information. The position of the sun, the angle of daylight, even the Earth's magnetic field. Researchers believe many species can detect these signals and use them as part of an internal guidance system that helps them travel across enormous distances with astonishing precision. But what makes the old fence post so interesting is that navigation alone does not fully explain it. Finding a region is one thing. Finding a familiar backyard is something else. And returning to a particular corner within that yard begins to feel even more personal. On cool spring mornings, when the shadows are still stretched across the grass and the neighborhood has not fully awakened, the robin often arrives without hesitation. It does not circle endlessly overhead. It does not seem uncertain. It moves with the quiet confidence of something following a memory. Researchers sometimes describe this ability as spatial memory, the capacity to build detailed mental maps of meaningful places. Yet when you watch the bird settle onto the weathered wood, the scientific term somehow feels smaller than the experience itself. Because memory is not only about location, memory is about significance. Something becomes familiar, something becomes trusted, something earns a place inside the mind. And perhaps that is why the sight feels so strangely moving. The science explains how the journey is possible, but it does not fully explain why certain places seem impossible to forget. After enough seasons, something subtle begins to change. You stop thinking of the robin as a visitor. The relationship remains quiet, almost invisible, yet it grows through repetition. Spring arrives. The morning light returns. And sooner or later, there it is again, perched on the weathered post as though no time has passed at all. The strange thing is not what the bird does. The strange thing is what happens inside you. Without realizing it, you begin looking for it. On certain mornings, your eyes drift toward that corner of the yard before the coffee has even cooled. The fence post becomes more than a piece of wood. It becomes a question, a possibility, a familiar chapter in a story that keeps repeating itself. Some mornings the robin stays only a few seconds. A slight tilt of the head, a glance across the grass, then gone. Other mornings it lingers while a soft breeze moves through the trees overhead. The yard feels different during those moments. Smaller somehow, more connected, as though countless seasons have folded together into a single quiet scene. And perhaps that is what familiarity really is. Not a single memory, but many memories layered one upon another until a place begins to carry a feeling of its own. The robin does not know your name. It does not understand the history of the yard. Yet every spring it participates in a ritual older than either of you. A return, a recognition, a continuation, and after watching it happen enough times, the fence post no longer feels ordinary. It feels like a meeting place between memory and time, a small fixed point in a changing world. And somehow, both you and the bird keep finding your way back to it. And this is where the story quietly becomes larger than a single backyard. Because the weathered post is not the only place carrying a memory. Across forests, neighborhoods, riverbanks, and open fields, countless birds are returning to locations that exist almost like invisible pins on a map only they can see. Every spring, while most people are sleeping, journeys are already unfolding overhead. Tiny bodies move through darkness, across states, across entire regions, guided by signals we cannot see and patterns we barely understand. Yet somehow, after all that distance, many arrive within yards of where they have been before. When you stop and imagine the scale of it, the feeling is difficult to shake. The robin that appears in the morning light is not simply arriving from the next street over. It may have traveled hundreds of miles through changing weather, unfamiliar landscapes, and shifting seasons. And still, it finds its way back to a corner of the world no larger than a backyard. The old fence post begins to feel different when viewed through that lens. Smaller than ever, yet somehow more important, a fixed point surrounded by an enormous moving world. And perhaps that is why the sight creates such wonder. Because beneath the ordinary appearance of daily life, there seems to be another layer operating quietly beneath the surface. A layer built from memory, direction, timing, and return. The kind of hidden order most people never notice because it asks nothing from them. It simply continues, year after year, season after season. But the deeper question is no longer how the robin finds the place. The deeper question is why this particular place remained important enough to be remembered at all. And that is where the mystery begins to open into something even larger. At some point, the question stops being scientific and becomes personal, not because the science disappears, but because it begins to brush against something many people have felt without ever finding the words for it. There are places that seem to stay with us, places that remain quietly present long after we leave them behind. A childhood backyard, a front porch illuminated by evening light, a gravel road that no longer looks the same, yet somehow feels exactly the same. Many people believe certain places hold more than physical features. Not in a supernatural sense necessarily, but in the way memory seems to settle into them. The way a location can carry the weight of seasons, experiences, and emotions long after the moment itself has passed. Standing in the yard year after year, watching the familiar arrival unfold against the backdrop of changing weather and changing time, it becomes difficult not to reflect on that possibility. The old fence post has no special value to anyone else. A stranger would walk past it without a second thought. Yet for the bird, it appears to remain meaningful. Something about that feels difficult to ignore. Researchers would likely describe it as memory, familiarity, and spatial recognition. And perhaps they are right. But even those explanations leave room for wonder, because familiarity itself is a remarkable thing. Out of an entire world filled with possibilities, certain places become anchors. Certain landscapes become part of an identity. Certain corners of the earth seem to call us back. Whether that feeling belongs only to humans or whether wild creatures experience some version of it as well is impossible to know. Yet each spring, as the morning sun reaches across the grass and the familiar silhouette appears once more, the question lingers in the quiet air, not demanding an answer, simply inviting reflection. Eventually, the need for an answer begins to fade. Not because the mystery has been solved, but because the experience itself becomes enough. The yard settles into another spring morning. Sunlight drifts across the grass. The branches move gently in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, another bird calls and then falls silent again. Nothing extraordinary is happening, and yet everything feels slightly different than it once did. The weathered fence post remains where it has always been. Season after season, standing quietly through rain, frost, summer heat, and long winter nights. There is something comforting about its persistence. Something equally comforting about the familiar visitor that continues to find it. You begin to realize that the story was never only about navigation or memory. It was also about continuity. In a world where so much changes without asking permission, there is something reassuring about a pattern that endures. A small ritual repeated beneath the notice of most people. A reminder that not every meaningful thing announces itself. Some arrive softly, some unfold over years. Some reveal themselves only to those willing to pay attention. The morning air feels still now. The kind of stillness that arrives just after a thought settles into place. Looking across the yard, it becomes easy to imagine how many hidden stories are unfolding around us every day. Quiet journeys, quiet returns, quiet connections stretching across distances we rarely consider. And perhaps that is why the sight stays with you. Not because it proves anything, not because it explains everything, but because for a brief moment, standing there in the early light, the world feels a little more connected than it did before, and that feeling lingers long after the bird has flown. Another spring arrives. The grass turns green again. The trees slowly fill with leaves. Morning light spills across the yard exactly as it has so many times before. And there, near the corner where the fence line meets the open lawn, the old wooden post is still standing. Weathered, quiet, unremarkable to anyone who does not know its story. Then, almost without ceremony, a familiar shape appears against the pale sky. It settles onto the wood for a few brief moments. The same place, the same stillness, the same quiet sense that something has completed a journey few of us will ever fully understand. And perhaps that is the real gift of moments like these. Not certainty, not answers, but perspective. The reminder that the world is filled with lives unfolding alongside our own, following patterns and purposes we rarely stop long enough to notice. The bird leaves after a few moments, disappearing beyond the trees. The yard becomes still again. Yet something remains behind. A feeling, a question, a quiet awareness that there may be far more memory, meaning, and connection woven into the natural world than we once believed. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was simply the remarkable intelligence of a wild creature finding its way through a changing world. But somehow, it never felt like only that. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. If stories like this speak to something in you, consider subscribing before you leave, because there are still countless mysteries hidden in plain sight around us, waiting to be noticed. And perhaps that is what these stories are really about. Learning to see what was always there, somewhere out there tonight. Beneath a sky full of stars, another small traveler may already be moving toward a place it remembers. And maybe, without realizing it, there is a place out there still remembering you too.